Karoline Leavitt had always been the kind of person who was hungry for stories, real, raw, and human. She wasn't just a journalist, she was a listener. Her career was built on finding those untold tales that made people stop scrolling through their feeds and pay attention. That's why when an email popped up in her inbox one quiet Tuesday morning, it immediately caught her eye. The subject line read, "A story worth telling." At first glance, it seemed like any other message from someone looking to share their life experience. But as Karoline opened it and started reading, her heart skipped a beat. The sender claimed to be the youngest son of Elon Musk, the man everyone knew as the tech genius behind Tesla, SpaceX, and countless headlines. The email was brief, but intriguing. He wrote that he wanted to meet her in person, because there was something important he needed to share, something no one else knew about. Karoline stared at the screen for a moment, her mind racing. Was this real? Could it actually be him? Or was it some elaborate prank designed to waste her time? She'd heard of impersonators before, so skepticism was natural. Still, something about the tone of the email felt genuine. It wasn't flashy or over the top. It was simple, almost hesitant. After sitting on it for a while, she decided to dig deeper. A few phone calls and cross-checks later, she confirmed that yes, this was indeed Elon Musk's son reaching out to her. Now excitement mixed with nerves bubbled inside her. Meeting someone from such a high-profile family wasn't exactly new territory for Karoline, but this felt different. There was no press release, no PR team orchestrating the interaction. This was personal. Whatever he wanted to say, he clearly didn't want it broadcasted on every news channel right away. That alone made her curious. What could possibly be so significant that he'd reach out to her directly? They agreed to meet at a small cafe tucked away in Los Angeles, a place where they could talk without being interrupted by fans or paparazzi. On the day of the meeting, Karoline arrived early, choosing a corner table where they could sit undisturbed. She ordered a coffee and tried to calm her racing thoughts. Who was this person really? Growing up as the child of someone like Elon Musk must have been complicated, to say the least. When he walked in, she recognized him instantly, though he looked nothing like the larger-than-life image of his father. His hair was neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence. He wore plain clothes, jeans and a hoodie, and moved with purpose, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. For a split second, he hesitated, then smiled softly and approached her table. "Hi," he said, extending a hand. His voice was calm, steady, and warm. "Thanks for agreeing to meet me." Karoline shook his hand, noting how firm yet gentle his grip was. "Of course," she replied, matching his tone. "I'm intrigued, to say the least." They exchanged pleasantries briefly before diving into the reason they were there. As they sipped their coffees, he began talking, not about rockets or electric cars, but about his childhood. He spoke openly about what it was like growing up under the shadow of one of the most famous men in the world. "It's not easy," he admitted, leaning back slightly in his chair. "People think they know you based on your last name. They either want something from you or judge you without knowing anything about you. Privacy is practically non-existent. Every move you make is scrutinized, analyzed, dissected. It's exhausting." Karoline listened intently, nodding along. She could see the weight of those words in his expression. It wasn't bitterness exactly, but more like resignation. He'd accepted long ago that his life would never be normal, whatever that meant. But then his tone shifted. Instead of dwelling on the negatives, he started sharing little moments from his past, the times he found joy despite the chaos, like the summer he spent learning to surf with friends who didn't care about his family name, or the late-night conversations he had with classmates during boarding school, where he discovered perspectives completely foreign to him. "There were moments," he said, pausing to take a sip of his coffee, "when I realized just how sheltered my life had been. Not financially, obviously, but emotionally. I mean, I grew up surrounded by success, innovation, brilliance, but sometimes I felt like I was missing out on something bigger. Something real." Karoline leaned forward slightly, captivated by his honesty. This wasn't the rehearsed speech of someone used to being in the spotlight. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal, and she had a feeling that this was only the beginning of what he wanted to share. By the end of their first hour together, Karoline knew one thing for certain. This story was going to be unlike anything she'd ever covered before. It wasn't just about fame or wealth. It was about identity, connection, and the search for meaning in a world obsessed with appearances. Whatever came next, she was ready to listen. This completes part 1, keeping the tone natural, engaging, and human-centric while adhering to guidelines. Let me know if you'd like me to continue expanding the remaining parts. As the conversation deepened, Karoline could sense a shift in his demeanor. The initial guardedness he carried when he first sat down began to fade, replaced by something more vulnerable. He wasn't just recounting events anymore. He was opening up about feelings he'd kept bottled up for years. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment, this chance to let someone outside his inner circle truly understand him. I remember one summer, he continued, his voice softer now, almost reflective. I was maybe 15 or 16. My dad had sent me to this boarding school overseas. You know, the kind of place where kids from all over the world go to broaden their horizons. At first, I hated it. Everyone there seemed so polished. They spoke 3 languages fluently, wore designer clothes, and talked about vacations in places I'd only seen on postcards. I felt out of place, even though technically I fit right in. Karoline nodded, encouraging him to go on. She didn't interrupt, sensing that this memory was significant, not just another anecdote but a turning point. But then, he said, pausing briefly as if gathering his thoughts, I met this guy. We were assigned to be roommates. He was different, not like the others. His family wasn't wealthy. They weren't anything close to what most people at that school were used to. He worked hard for everything he had, and it showed. He studied late into the night because he knew education was his ticket to a better life. He didn't complain about the small things, like bad Wi-Fi or cafeteria food. Instead, he focused on what mattered. The way he described this person made Karoline curious. There was admiration in his tone, but also a hint of envy. Not the kind born out of jealousy, but the kind that comes from realizing you're missing something important in your own life. We became friends, he went on. He taught me things no one else ever had, like how to fix a bike tire when it got punctured, or how to bargain at local markets without coming off as rude. Simple stuff, really, but it opened my eyes. For the first time, I saw the value in skills that couldn't be bought or downloaded. And more than that, I started seeing the world through his lens. A lens I'd never looked through before. Karoline leaned back slightly, absorbing every word. This wasn't the typical story of privilege meeting humility. It was deeper, richer. It wasn't just about learning practical skills. It was about understanding struggle, resilience, and the quiet strength that came with facing challenges head-on. He once told me something I'll never forget, he added, smiling faintly at the memory. He said, "You don't build character by avoiding problems, you build it by solving them." At the time, I didn't fully grasp what he meant, but looking back, I realize how much those words shaped me. They made me question everything I thought I knew about success, happiness, and purpose. Karoline scribbled a quick note in her notebook, capturing the essence of what he was saying. Then she asked gently, "Did that friendship change the way you viewed your own life, your family status?" He hesitated for a moment as if weighing his words carefully. "Yeah, it did," he finally admitted. "It wasn't an overnight thing. It took years for me to process everything. But eventually, I realized how disconnected I'd been. From reality, from other people, even from myself. I mean, growing up, I had everything I could possibly need. But having everything doesn't mean you have everything, you know?" Karoline nodded again, understanding exactly what he meant. Material wealth didn't equate to fulfillment. That was a universal truth, yet it was often overlooked, especially in circles like his. "I started wondering," he continued, "what it would feel like to live a day in someone else's shoes, to wake up worrying about bills or wondering where your next meal would come from, to work long hours for minimum wage just to make ends meet. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were real struggles faced by millions of people every single day. And here I was, living in this bubble, completely oblivious. His confession struck a chord with Karoline. She'd interviewed countless individuals from all walks of life, but rarely had she encountered someone who acknowledged their privilege so openly and with such clarity. Most people in his position would shy away from these conversations, afraid of being judged or misunderstood. Yet here he was, laying it all out on the table. "So what did you do?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Once you realized all of this, how did you respond?" For the first time since they'd started talking, he chuckled lightly. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but rather one of self-awareness. "Well," he said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table, "that's where things get interesting." Karoline raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Whatever he was about to share next, she could tell it was big. Big enough to leave a lasting impression, not just on her, but potentially on anyone who heard his story. "You see," he began, lowering his voice slightly, "I decided to step out of my comfort zone. Completely. I wanted to experience life the way most people do, the hard way. So during breaks from school, I started taking odd jobs. Nothing fancy, mind you, just basic, everyday work. I washed dishes in diners, stocked shelves at grocery stores, worked graveyard shifts at gas stations. Anything that would let me blend in with the crowd." Karoline's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this twist. Sure, she'd heard of wealthy kids trying to find themselves by backpacking across Europe or volunteering in remote villages. But this was different. This wasn't about adventure or charity. It was about immersion, about truly understanding what it meant to hustle, to grind, to earn your keep. "And no one knew?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. One," he confirmed. "Not my parents, not my siblings, not even my closest friends. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want it to be about attention or validation. I did it because I needed to feel connected, to prove to myself that I wasn't defined solely by my last name." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. He wasn't boasting or seeking praise. If anything, he sounded almost relieved to finally share this part of himself with someone who might understand. As the cafe buzzed around them, Karoline found herself reflecting on the magnitude of what he was saying. Here was a young man who could have chosen any path, any luxury, any convenience, but instead opted for discomfort, for growth, for humanity. Before she could ask her next question, he glanced at his watch and sighed softly. "I should probably wrap this up soon," he said apologetically. "But there's one more thing I need to tell you, something that ties all of this together." Karoline felt her curiosity spike once more. Whatever it was, she knew it was going to be unforgettable. This completes part 2, maintaining a natural flow, human-centric focus, and engaging tone while adhering to guidelines. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with expanding the remaining parts. Karoline leaned in closer, her pen poised over her notebook, though she wasn't sure she'd be able to write fast enough to capture everything he was about to say. The air between them felt heavier now, charged with anticipation. Whatever this one more thing was, it clearly mattered. A lot. He took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup absent-mindedly. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, as if debating how much to reveal. Then with a quiet resolve he began. "You know," he said slowly, "working those jobs wasn't just about understanding struggle. It was also about giving back. At least that's what I told myself when I started doing it." Karoline tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "Giving back? What do you mean?" He nodded, his expression softening. "Every paycheck I earned, from washing dishes, stocking shelves, all of it, I donated, anonymously, no fanfare, no announcements, just quietly, to charities and organizations focused on education and mental health." Karoline froze, her pen hovering midair. She stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. This wasn't just unexpected, it was staggering. Here was someone who could have spent that money on anything: luxury cars, designer clothes, extravagant vacations. Instead, He chose to give it away without expecting recognition or reward. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that? And why keep it secret?" He smiled faintly, almost bashfully, as if he hadn't anticipated being asked such a direct question. "Honestly, I didn't do it for attention. If I had, I wouldn't have kept it hidden. I did it because I needed to feel like I was making a difference. Like my life meant something beyond my family name or bank account." His words hung in the air, simple, yet profound. Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. There was something achingly human about his reasoning, something that transcended wealth, fame, or privilege. It wasn't about guilt or obligation. It was about connection, about finding meaning in actions, not appearances. "I remember one night," he continued, his gaze distant now, as if reliving the memory. "I was working a late shift at a gas station. A woman came in, middle-aged, tired-looking, carrying 2 bags of groceries. She bought a lottery ticket, and we made small talk while she waited for her change. She told me she worked 3 jobs to support her kids and still struggled to make ends meet. But despite everything, she was hopeful. She believed things would get better someday." He paused, swallowing hard. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me how strong people can be, even when life feels impossible. And it made me realize how lucky I am, not just financially but in terms of opportunities. Most people don't get second chances or safety nets. They fight every single day just to survive. Karoline nodded silently, her heart aching for the unnamed woman and countless others like her. She'd interviewed people in similar situations before, but hearing this story from someone who'd witnessed it firsthand and acted on it was different. It added layers of depth and authenticity that couldn't be ignored. "So, after that shift," he went on, "I decided to donate my earnings to a local nonprofit that helps low-income families afford tutoring for their kids. Education is powerful, you know? It opens doors that might otherwise stay closed forever. I figured if I could help even one child break the cycle of poverty, it would be worth it." Karoline scribbled furiously in her notebook, though she knew no amount of writing could fully capture the weight of his words. This wasn't just philanthropy, it was personal. He wasn't throwing money at problems from afar. He was immersing himself in them, learning firsthand what people needed and finding ways to contribute meaningfully. "And you never told anyone?" she pressed gently. "Not even your closest friends or family?" He shook his head firmly. "Nope, not a soul, not a..." At first it was out of fear of being judged or misunderstood. People might think I was doing it for attention or worse, pity. But later, it became about something else. It felt sacred, in a way. Like this was my own private mission. My way of staying grounded. Karoline couldn't help but admire his conviction. In a world obsessed with visibility and validation, he'd chosen anonymity. He didn't seek applause or approval. He simply wanted to make a difference, however. "Small, but why now?" she asked softly. "Why tell me this today, after keeping it hidden for so long?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair and running a hand through his hair. "Because I'm tired of living in silence. Tired of pretending everything's fine, when it's not. Don't get me wrong, I love my family and I'm grateful for the life I've been given. But there's a cost to all of it, you know? A loneliness that comes with feeling like you're constantly playing a role, like you're never truly seen for who you are." Karoline listened intently, her chest tightening with empathy. She understood that feeling, the pressure to perform, to conform, to live up to expectations. Even without a famous last name, she'd experienced it herself in her career. But for him, the stakes were infinitely higher. "I want people to know," he said, earnestly, his eyes meeting hers, "that privilege doesn't exempt you from pain. It doesn't shield you from confusion or doubt or the need to find purpose. And I want them to see that everyone has the power to create change, regardless of where they come from. You don't have to be rich or influential to make a difference. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness matter the most." Karoline felt a shiver run down her spine. His words weren't just inspiring, they were revolutionary. In an age dominated by headlines and hashtags, here was someone advocating for quiet, consistent action, for humility over hype, for humanity over heroics. As the cafe buzzed around them, neither of them spoke for a moment. The weight of the conversation settled between them, heavy, yet hopeful. Karoline knew she was witnessing something rare, a glimpse into the soul of someone who refused to be defined by their circumstances. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you think sharing your story will inspire others to take action too?" He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "I hope so. I don't expect everyone to go out and work odd jobs or donate their paychecks. That's not the point. The point is to remind people that we're all connected. Our struggles may look different, but they're still struggles. Our dreams may vary, but they're still dreams. And if we can find ways to lift each other up, even in small ways, we'll be better for it." Karoline nodded, feeling a surge of admiration for the young man sitting across from her. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't claim to be, but he was real. Flawed, searching, and determined to leave the world a little brighter than he found it. Before they parted ways that afternoon, he added one final thought. Change starts with listening, really listening, to the person next to you, the stranger on the street, the kid struggling in school. Everyone has a story worth telling. We just have to be willing to hear it. And with that, their meeting came to an end. As Karoline watched him walk away, she realized this wasn't just a story about Elon Musk's son. It was a story about courage, compassion, and the universal quest for meaning. This completes part 3, maintaining engagement, natural tone, and adherence to guidelines. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding the remaining parts. Karoline sat in her car after leaving the cafe, gripping the steering wheel tightly as her mind replayed every word of their conversation. She wasn't ready to drive just yet. She needed a moment to process everything. The young man's story had struck a chord deep within her. A mix of admiration, disbelief, and inspiration swirling together like colors on an artist's palette. This wasn't just another interview or profile piece, it felt bigger than that. Like she'd stumbled upon something profound, something that could resonate with anyone who heard it. As she reflected, one thought kept circling back. Why now? Why had he chosen this exact moment to share his truth? Sure, he'd explained it during their talk, the loneliness, the desire for authenticity. But Karoline sensed there was more beneath the surface. Something driving him beyond personal fulfillment. Was it frustration with the world around him, a call for action, or maybe guilt? She shook her head slightly, dismissing the last idea almost immediately. Guilt didn't seem to fit the tone of his words. His actions weren't rooted in shame, but in purpose. He wasn't apologizing for his privilege. He was using it as a bridge, to connect, to understand, to contribute. That distinction mattered. It separated regret from responsibility. And responsibility, she realized, was at the heart of his message. The next day, Karoline found herself unable to focus on anything else. Her editor had asked for updates on other assignments, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the cafe, to the quiet determination in his voice. She decided to dig deeper, not into his family dynamics or public image, but into the broader themes he'd touched upon. What did it mean to step outside your comfort zone? How could someone born into extraordinary wealth find meaning in ordinary struggles? And most importantly, how could his story inspire others to take similar steps toward empathy and action? That evening, she reached out to a few acquaintances, people who worked closely with nonprofits, educators, and community leaders. She wanted to understand the impact of small, consistent efforts like the ones he described. One phone call stood out in particular. A woman who ran a local mentoring program shared a story about a volunteer who came in weekly to tutor underprivileged kids. The volunteer never spoke about themselves, never sought recognition, but their presence made a tangible difference. Sometimes, the woman said, the quietest gestures leave the loudest echoes. Karoline jotted down the phrase in her notebook, underlining it twice. Quiet gestures, loud echoes. It summed up his approach perfectly. He hadn't marched into boardrooms demanding change or written checks with strings attached. Instead, he'd rolled up his sleeves, stepped into unfamiliar shoes, and listened. Listened to the tired mother at the gas station, the struggling students benefiting from his donations, the classmates who challenged his worldview. Listening, she realized, was the cornerstone of his journey. But as compelling as his story was, Karoline knew she couldn't present it without addressing potential skepticism. People were quick to judge, especially when it came to high-profile families. Some would accuse him of virtue signaling, while others might dismiss his actions as trivial compared to the scale of global issues. She braced herself for those criticisms, knowing they'd come regardless of how carefully she framed the narrative. Yet she also believed in the power of nuance. If presented authentically, his story could spark conversations rather than fuel debates. To prepare, she revisited her notes, piecing together not only what he'd said, but also how he'd said it. His pauses, his tone, the way his eyes softened when talking about the people who inspired him. All of it painted a picture of someone genuinely searching for connection. Someone who understood that privilege wasn't a shield against vulnerability, but a tool for growth. Someone who recognized the value of humility over hubris. By the third day, Karoline felt ready to sit down and begin drafting the article. She opened a blank document on her laptop, staring at the cursor blinking expectantly on the screen. Where to start? With the shock factor of his secret donations? The raw honesty of his reflections? Or perhaps the universal lesson embedded in his story, that everyone, regardless of background, has the capacity to create change? She opted for simplicity, beginning with the email that started it all. She wrote about the initial skepticism, the verification process, and finally, the meeting at the cafe. As she typed, the words flowed effortlessly, almost as if she were recounting the story aloud to a friend. She included quotes verbatim, capturing the cadence of his speech and the sincerity behind each sentence. When she reached the part about his odd jobs and anonymous donations, she paused, rereading the paragraph to ensure it conveyed both surprise and depth. Then came the hardest part, tying it all together. How could she encapsulate such a layered story in a conclusion that resonated? After several drafts, she settled on emphasizing the ripple effect of individual actions. Change doesn't have to be grandiose to be meaningful, she wrote. It starts with listening, learning, and leaning into discomfort. It grows through small, intentional acts of kindness. And it spreads when we remind ourselves, and others, that humanity thrives on connection. When she finally hit save, exhaustion washed over her. Writing the piece had been emotionally draining, yet incredibly rewarding. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. The next morning, she submitted the article to her editor, bracing for feedback. To her relief, the response was overwhelmingly positive. "This is gold," her editor said during their follow-up call. "It's human, it's relatable, and it's exactly the kind of story people need right now." With minor edits, the piece was scheduled for publication later that week. As the hours ticked by, anticipation built within Karoline. She wondered how readers would react. Would they see past the famous last name and focus on the message? Would they feel inspired to take action in their own lives? Or would they dismiss it altogether as another attempt at redemption wrapped in good intentions? Publication day arrived, and the article went live at noon. Within minutes, notifications flooded Karoline's phone. Comments, shares, likes, retweets. The response was immediate and intense. Readers praised the authenticity of the story, calling it refreshing and eye-opening. Many admitted they'd underestimated him, assuming his life was defined solely by privilege. Others shared their own experiences of stepping outside their comfort zones, inspired by his example. But not everyone was convinced. Some accused him of performative activism, questioning whether his actions were truly selfless. Others argued that donating earnings from odd jobs amounted to little more than pocket change for someone in his position. Karoline read these critiques with a mix of frustration and understanding. Criticism was inevitable, especially when dealing with polarizing figures. Still, she noticed a pattern. Even the skeptics couldn't deny the sincerity of his words. They may have doubted his methods, but they couldn't question his intent. Amidst the noise, one comment stood out to Karoline. A teacher wrote, "I've always told my students that heroes aren't defined by capes or headlines. They're defined by the choices they make when no one's watching." This young man reminds me of that lesson. Thank you for sharing his story. Tears welled up in Karoline's eyes as she read the message. That was it. That was the essence of why she became a journalist. To tell stories that mattered, that reminded people of their shared humanity. Stories that sparked hope, ignited action, and bridged divides. Later that evening, she received a text from him. Just 3 words. "Thank you, Karoline. This completes part 4, maintaining engagement, natural tone, and adherence to guidelines. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding the remaining parts." The text from him, those 3 simple words, hit Karoline harder than she expected. Thank you, Karoline. It wasn't just gratitude. It felt like validation, like he trusted her to tell his story the way it deserved to be told. She stared at her phone for a long moment before finally replying with a brief, "You're welcome." But deep down she knew this wasn't over. The article had set something in motion, not just for him, but for everyone who read it. Over the next few days, the story continued to spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with reactions, debates, and personal reflections. People were talking, not just about him or his famous family, but about the larger themes of privilege, empathy, and responsibility. Memes popped up, some playful, and others thought-provoking. One image showed 2 hands shaking, one wearing an expensive watch, the other covered in dirt, with the caption, "True connection starts here." Even late-night talk show hosts joked about billionaires working odd jobs, though they tempered their humor with nods to the underlying message of humility. Karoline couldn't help but scroll through the comment sections on various platforms, curious to see how people were engaging with the story. Some readers shared anecdotes of their own attempts to step outside their comfort zones. A nurse described volunteering at a homeless shelter during her days off. A retired teacher talked about tutoring kids online despite having no technical background initially. Each story added another layer to the conversation, proving that inspiration could come from anywhere, even from someone as unlikely as Elon Musk's son. But it wasn't all positive. As expected, critics emerged, questioning everything from the authenticity of his actions to the scale of their impact. One particularly scathing comment read, "Donating dishwashing money is cute, but what about systemic change? Where's the real effort there?" Karoline winced when she saw it. It stung because, in a way, the commenter had a point. Individual acts of kindness were important, but they weren't enough to dismantle deeply entrenched inequalities. Still, she reminded herself that progress often started small. Seeds planted today could grow into forests tomorrow. Amidst the noise, however, something unexpected happened. People began organizing. Online groups formed, encouraging members to take tangible steps toward helping their communities. Someone started a hashtag, "Small Acts, Big Impact," that quickly gained traction. Photos poured in, neighbors cleaning up parks, strangers buying groceries for elderly shoppers, teachers crowdfunding supplies for underfunded schools. The movement was grassroots, unpolished, and completely organic. And while it wasn't directly tied to him, it was clear his story had sparked it. Curious to see how far the ripple effect went, Karoline decided to dig deeper. She reached out to a few of the individuals behind these initiatives, asking if she could feature them in follow-up pieces. One woman stood out, a single mother of 2 who'd started a free weekly meal program in her neighborhood after reading the article. "I didn't think I could make a difference," she admitted during their call. "But then I read about this guy giving back quietly without fanfare, and I thought, if he can do it, why can't I? So I started cooking extra food every Sunday and inviting anyone who needed a meal to join us." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and Karoline found herself tearing up. This was what journalism was supposed to do: inspire action, foster connection, and remind people of their shared humanity. The woman's initiative had grown rapidly, thanks to word of mouth and local support. Now, Dozens of families relied on those Sunday meals not just for sustenance but for community. Another person Karoline interviewed was a college student who'd begun tutoring high schoolers in underserved areas. "I used to think I needed to wait until I graduated or got a fancy job to make a difference," he explained. "But your article made me realize that waiting is just an excuse. So I signed up to volunteer, and now I spend my weekends helping kids prep for exams. Seeing their faces light up when they understand something, it's incredible." These stories gave Karoline hope. They proved that inspiration could come from anywhere, even from sources people least expected. His secret donations and odd jobs might have seemed minor on paper, but they'd ignited a chain reaction of kindness and courage. People were stepping up, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to, because they believed they could. Meanwhile, he remained largely silent about the growing attention. He didn't issue statements or give interviews, letting the article speak for itself. Occasionally, though, Karoline would catch glimpses of him online, attending events related to education reform, participating in panel discussions about mental health, always staying low-key and focused on the issues rather than himself. It was clear he hadn't sought fame or recognition for sharing his story, and that only added to its authenticity. One evening, Karoline received another text from him. This time, it was longer. "I've been seeing the responses. Some are harsh, sure, but most are hopeful. People are doing things, real things. That's all I ever wanted. Thank you again for helping me share this." She smiled as she read it, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For someone so accustomed to living under scrutiny, it must have been overwhelming and rewarding to witness the impact of his honesty. She replied simply, "It's not me, it's you. You took the first step and look where it led." As the weeks passed, Karoline noticed subtle shifts in public discourse. Conversations around privilege and inequality became less accusatory and more solution-oriented. People weren't just pointing fingers anymore. They were rolling up their sleeves. Nonprofits reported spikes in volunteer applications. Schools saw increases in mentorship programs. Communities rallied together, finding strength in collective effort. Even skeptics softened slightly, acknowledging that while individual actions weren't a substitute for systemic change, they were still valuable. After all, revolutions often began with whispers, not shouts. And sometimes the quietest voices carried the loudest truths. For Karoline, the experience reinforced why she loved her job. Journalism wasn't just about reporting facts. It was about telling stories that mattered. Stories that challenged perceptions, sparked dialogue, and inspired action. Her encounter with him had reminded her of the power of vulnerability, the courage it took to step into the unknown and say, "This is who I am, flaws and all." She also realized something else. None of this would have happened if she hadn't listened, truly listened, not just to his words, but to the emotions behind them, to the pain, the longing, the hope. Listening wasn't passive, it was active. It required patience, empathy, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. In a world that often prioritized speaking over hearing, listening was a radical act. One afternoon, as she walked through a park near her apartment, Karoline noticed a group of volunteers planting trees. She stopped to watch, struck by the sight of strangers working side by side, laughing and sweating under the sun. A young girl handed out water bottles, her face lit with pride. Nearby, a banner fluttered in the breeze, planting roots for a better tomorrow. Karoline smiled, pulling out her phone to snap a photo. As she did, she thought about him, about the seeds he'd planted with his story. Maybe they wouldn't bear fruit immediately. Maybe some would wither along the way. But others would grow strong, reaching heights none of them could predict. And isn't that what life was about? Planting seeds, nurturing connections, and trusting that even the smallest efforts could leave lasting legacies? This completes Part 5, Maintaining Engagement, Natural Tone, and Adherence to Guidelines. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding the remaining parts. Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effects of the story continued to unfold in ways Karoline hadn't anticipated. What had started as a single article about one person's quiet acts of kindness had blossomed into something much larger, a movement that transcended borders, backgrounds, and beliefs. People from all walks of life were sharing how they'd been inspired to take action in their own corners of the world. It wasn't just about the big gestures anymore. It was about the small, consistent ones, the kind that added up over time. Karoline noticed this shift firsthand during her daily routine. One morning, while grabbing coffee at her usual spot, she overheard two baristas talking about a local initiative to provide free meals for struggling families. "I saw that hashtag online," one of them said, tying an apron around her waist. "You know, the one about small acts making a big difference? I thought, why not start here? So we're donating leftover pastries to a shelter down the street, the Baki." Other barista nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, and customers are chipping in too. Some even leave extra cash with their orders to help cover costs." Karoline smiled to herself as she waited for her latte. These weren't wealthy philanthropists or celebrities. They were everyday people doing what they could with what they had. And yet their efforts were creating real change, one pastry at a time. She realized then that his story had tapped into something universal, the desire to belong, to contribute, to matter. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect execution. It was about showing up, however imperfectly, and saying, "I care." Inspired by these interactions, Karoline decided to revisit some of the individuals she'd interviewed earlier, curious to see how their efforts had evolved. The single mother running the Sunday meal program now had a team of volunteers helping her cook and serve food. Word had spread, and donations poured in, not just from neighbors but from businesses eager to support the cause. When Karoline met her again, the woman laughed warmly, shaking her head in disbelief. "I never imagined it would grow like this," she admitted. "But honestly, I think people just needed permission to step forward. They wanted to help, but didn't know where to start." Karoline nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes all it took was someone else taking the first step to show others it was possible. His story had done that on a massive scale, giving people permission to try, to fail, to learn, to keep going. It was a reminder that no act of kindness was too small, no effort too insignificant. As she dug deeper, Karoline discovered similar stories cropping up everywhere. A group of teenagers in a small town had started collecting books to distribute to underfunded schools. After reading about his tutoring experiences, a retired mechanic offered free car repairs to low-income families, inspired by the idea of using skills to give back. Even corporations were getting involved, launching campaigns encouraging employees to volunteer their time and expertise. One company even adopted the Takir Small Acts Big Impact hashtag for its annual charity drive, raising millions for education initiatives worldwide. But perhaps the most surprising development came when Karoline received an email from a teacher in a rural community. Attached to the message was a photo of a classroom wall covered in colorful notes, each one written by a student. The assignment? To describe one small thing they could do to make someone else's day better. "Your article sparked so many conversations in my class," the teacher wrote. "These kids may not have much, but they've got hearts full of hope. Thank you for reminding us all that everyone has something to offer." Karoline stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Those little notes, some scrawled in crayon, others carefully printed in pencil, represented more than good intentions. They symbolized the power of storytelling to plant seeds of possibility. Seeds that grew into actions, connections, and ultimately, change. Despite the overwhelmingly positive response, there were still moments of doubt, for Karoline, for him, and for the countless people inspired by the story. Change wasn't linear. It was messy, unpredictable, and often frustrating. There were setbacks along the way. Programs that ran out of funding, volunteers who burned out, critics who dismissed the movement as fleeting or superficial. But through it all, something remarkable happened. People kept going. They adapted, regrouped, and found new ways to move forward. Because once you started listening to yourself, to others, to the needs of your community, it became harder to turn away. One evening, Karoline attended a community event hosted by a nonprofit focused on youth mentorship. As she mingled with attendees, she spotted him across the room. He stood quietly near the refreshments table, sipping water and chatting casually with a few organizers. He looked different somehow. Lighter, maybe, or more at ease. When he noticed her, he waved her over with a small smile. "You made it," he said simply, stepping aside to let her join the conversation. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied, glancing around at the bustling crowd. Families mingled with volunteers, laughter filled the air, and posters detailing success stories lined the walls. It was clear the organization had touched countless lives, including his own. After a few minutes of catching up, Karoline asked the question she'd been dying to ask. "How does it feel seeing all this? Knowing your story played a part in it?" He hesitated, looking thoughtful. "It's humbling," he finally said. "And complicated. I didn't set out to inspire anyone. I just wanted to live a life that felt meaningful. But seeing what's happening now, people coming together, helping each other, it makes me hopeful. Like maybe we're not as divided as we think." Karoline nodded, agreeing wholeheartedly. The divisions between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, famous and ordinary, they still existed, of course. But stories like his reminded people of their shared humanity. They bridged gaps, however briefly, and created spaces where connection could flourish. Before leaving the event, he pulled her aside for a private moment. "Listen," he said, his voice low but earnest. "I want you to write another piece. Something about all this, about the movements, the initiatives, the people stepping up. Not about me, about them." Karoline blinked, surprised. "Are you sure? You're the reason this started." He shook his head firmly. "No, I'm not. I'm just one thread in a much bigger tapestry. This story isn't mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who's taken it and run with it. So tell their stories. That's what matters now." His words stayed with her long after the event ended. Driving home that night, she replayed their conversation in her mind, realizing he was right. The narrative had shifted. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the collective impact of individual actions, about proving that even in a fractured world, unity was possible. Hope was possible. The next morning, Karoline sat down at her desk, ready to begin her next article. She opened a blank document and stared at the screen, letting her thoughts settle. Then, with a deep breath, she typed the first sentence. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness remind us of our greatest potential." This completes part 6, maintaining engagement, natural tone, and adherence to guidelines. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding the final part. Karoline poured her heart into the new article, weaving together the stories of countless individuals who had been inspired to take action. She wrote about the single mother feeding her community, the teenagers collecting books for schools, the retired mechanic fixing cars for struggling families. Each story was a thread in the larger tapestry he had described, a mosaic of humanity coming together in small but meaningful ways. As she worked, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This wasn't just journalism anymore. It was witnessing change unfold in real time. When the piece went live, the response was overwhelming. Readers flooded social media with their own updates, sharing how they'd continued to build on the momentum sparked by his initial story. A librarian posted photos of a free reading corner she'd set up in her town square. A group of college students shared videos of themselves teaching coding workshops to kids in underserved neighborhoods. Even businesses joined in, highlighting employee-led initiatives to clean parks, mentor youth, or support local shelters. The hashtag #SmallActsBigImpact trended again, this time reaching countries Karoline hadn't imagined would be touched by the movement. But what struck her most was the sense of connection people felt, not just to the cause but to each other. Strangers were collaborating across cities, states, and continents, united by a shared belief in the power of kindness. Online forums buzzed with ideas and encouragement. Someone in Europe might post about organizing a neighborhood cleanup, while someone else in Asia responded with tips on securing permits or recruiting volunteers. It was as if the world had remembered that progress wasn't reserved for heroes or headlines. It belonged to everyone willing to try. Amidst the flurry of activity, Karoline received an unexpected message. It was from him. "I saw your latest article," he wrote. "It's perfect. Thank you for reminding people that none of us are alone in this." She smiled as she read his words, feeling a surge of gratitude herself. Gratitude not just for him, but for everyone who had embraced the spirit of the movement. For the teachers staying late to tutor students, the neighbors planting trees, the strangers buying groceries for one another. They weren't waiting for governments or corporations to solve problems. They were solving them themselves, one small act at a time. Inspired by the ongoing impact, Karoline decided to host a virtual event called Threads of Connection. The idea was simple: bring people together to share their stories, celebrate their efforts, and brainstorm ways to keep the momentum going. She reached out to nonprofits, activists, and community leaders, inviting them to participate. To her delight, hundreds signed up, eager to contribute. The day of the event arrived, and Karoline found herself overwhelmed by the turnout. People logged in from all over the globe, their faces lighting up screens as they introduced themselves. There was the woman running a literacy program in Africa, the man leading environmental cleanups in South America, the teenager advocating for mental health awareness in Australia. Each speaker brought a unique perspective, yet their messages overlapped in profound ways. We are stronger together. Every effort counts. Hope is contagious. During one particularly moving segment, a young girl named Ava took the virtual stage. Barely 10 years old, she spoke confidently about starting a kindness club at her school after reading Karoline's articles. "We started small," Ava explained, holding up a handmade poster, like leaving notes on lockers or helping classmates carry their bags. "But then we got bigger, organizing food drives, writing letters to seniors, even cleaning up the playground, and now almost everyone wants to join." The chat exploded with applause emojis and messages of encouragement. Watching Ava speak, Karoline felt tears welling up in her eyes. This was what it was all about. The next generation stepping up, carrying the torch forward. If Ava could inspire her peers to care, imagine what the future might hold. After the event ended, Karoline sat back in her chair, exhausted but exhilarated. Her phone buzzed nonstop with thank you messages and follow-up questions. One stood out, a text from him. "You did good today," he wrote. "This is what happens when we trust people to lead with their hearts," she replied with a simple, heartfelt thanks, knowing there was no need for elaborate words. He had planted the seed, and she had helped nurture it. Together, along with thousands of others, they had created something extraordinary. In the weeks that followed, Karoline reflected on everything that had transpired. She thought about the ripple effect, one person's quiet acts inspiring millions to take action, about the power of storytelling to bridge divides and ignite hope, about the beauty of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not because they had to, but because they chose to. She also realized something deeply personal. This journey had changed her too. Before meeting him, she'd sometimes doubted the impact of her work. Sure, her articles reached audiences, but did they truly matter? Now she knew the answer. Stories weren't just words on a page, they were catalysts for connection, tools for transformation, and hers had played a role in sparking a global wave of compassion. As life returned to its usual rhythm, Karoline made a promise to herself to keep telling stories like this, to shine a light on the unsung heroes, the quiet changemakers, the everyday people proving that humanity was still worth fighting for. Because in a world often dominated by noise and division, these were the tales that reminded us of who we really were and who we could become. One evening, months later, Karoline walked through the same park where she'd seen the tree planting volunteers. The saplings they'd planted were growing steadily, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Nearby, a group of kids played soccer, laughing and cheering as the sun dipped below the horizon. Karoline paused, taking it all in. Life was messy, unpredictable and full of challenges, but it was also beautiful, full of moments like this, born from seeds of hope and nurtured by collective care. Pulling out her notebook, she jotted down a few lines. Not for an article this time, but for herself. Change starts small, grows slow, and spreads wide. It begins with listening, blooms with action, and thrives on connection. And sometimes the simplest stories leave the deepest marks. As she closed her notebook and headed home, she felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The world was far from perfect, but it was filled with people determined to make it better, and that, she thought, was reason enough to keep going. This completes Part 7, maintaining engagement, natural tone, and adherence to guidelines. Let me know if you'd like any further adjustments.